All right, hello. My name is Ina Mossin. As he presented, I'm a recent graduate from the Fletcher School. And I'm very excited to be here today to speak about a topic in a region that I've been personally invested in for so long. And also thank you very much to the presenters on the table for a very detailed presentation about the North Caucasus insurgency and its roots in the Chechen conflict. Just to give you a very quick recap of my own background, prior to Fletcher, I worked in different positions in the Caucasus. I spent first some time with the Norwegian embassy in Baku, after which I lived in Abkhazia in Georgia for some 7 months. And after this time, I have been back to the region pretty much every year, and most recently as a research associate with International Crisis Group, whom I helped write their most recent three-party report on the sources and dynamics of the North Caucasus conflict. So before I start my short presentation, I would like to thank Ben very much for organizing this Caucasus Forum. I know he's been working very, very hard. And I'm also very excited to see so many of you here today because it's a Friday and it's late and it's great to see so many of you. So I was asked to speak about the implications of the recent Crimean crisis for the North Caucasus. However, I think a more interesting take on the topic is really how can studying the Caucasus help us understand better what is happening in the Ukraine right now and what the implications of the recent Crimean secession and decision to join Russia might be for the Crimean population. So I decided to switch around the topic a little bit, and I hope that's okay with everyone. So without going too much into the whys of the current Ukrainian crisis, I would like to elaborate on two observations. The first one pertaining to Russia's use of frozen conflicts to achieve their foreign policy objectives. And the second one about what Crimea might expect as a newly seceded and reintegrated state within a Russian federation. So from studying the Caucasus, it is clear that the Russian foreign policy behavior in the Ukraine is not something particularly new. If you look at any map of the Black Sea region, which I don't have here, unfortunately, but you can imagine it in your head, you can see it literally dotted with secessionist conflicts, more or less all of them sparked by a Russian military intervention. From Transnistria in 1990 to South Ossetia in 1992, Abkhazia in 1994, and of course Nagorno-Karabakh also since 1994. All of these conflicts are characterized by, their frozen state, first of all, but secondly also by the fact that Russia is the key to any solutions, and that Russia are using them actively to uphold their leverage over the countries involved. In fact, of the 6 states in the European Union's Eastern Partnership, only 2 countries, Armenia and Belarus, do not have currently unresolved conflicts on their territory. Not coincidentally, you might say, they are also the only 2 countries that are members of the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, or the CSTO, and also countries who plan to join the proposed Eurasian Union. So from studying the Caucasus, we can easily see that the Russian foreign policy is characterized by continuity and not change, quite contrary to many foreign policy experts might claim these days. There's a lot of talk about the Russian foreign policy being something completely out of this world, but for those of us who study the Caucasus, it's very easy to remark because it's incredibly consistent with what has been going on for the last 20 years. So back to my point about Crimea and why I think studying the Caucasus is really fruitful to understand the Crimean crisis better, is that Crimea and the Caucasus, and the North Caucasus in particular, are very similar in many ways. They're both geographically remote regions. They're places that are heavily militarized, with the presence of Russian military and military bases. And they're also places where there's a lot of ethnic minorities and competing ethnic communities competing for limited resources. So studying regional development in the North Caucasus over the last 20 years helps us understand the new domestic, political, legislative, and economic circumstances that may face Crimea as it joins the Russian Federation. And I will focus on two areas. Firstly, the implications for the Crimean population itself, and secondly, the implications for regional autonomy and economic development in Crimea. And firstly, I believe that ethnic tensions are quite likely to rise as a consequence of the current occupation, based on studying the North Caucasus. The Crimean Tatars, as you might know about, are an ethnic minority population in Crimea that have already voiced very deep concern with what they see as the republic's return to Russia. The Crimean Tatars are a group of about 300,000 people, and they make up about 15% of Crimea's current population. Like the Chechens and many of the other peoples of the Northern Caucasus, they were deported by Stalin in the after-war years, allegedly for their collaboration with the Germans. And they were only allowed to return to their homeland after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Since that time, the Crimean Tatars, like the Chechens, like the Ingush, have lived under very poor conditions since their return. In the Northern Caucasus, unresolved disputes between the returned populations and the new communities who, in the meanwhile, had moved in and taken over the villages and lands of the deported population, now is underlying and fueling much of the regional tension and interethnic tensions that we're seeing in the North Caucasus. And the same is feared that will be the case in Crimea. With regards to the occupation, Putin has promised the Crimean Tatars that upon unification with Russia, their historical rights will be restored according to the 1991 law of rehabilitation of repressed peoples. This is a very controversial law, and which promises to return land to formerly deported populations under Stalin. However, if we look at the North Caucasus and seeing what the implications for the deported populations of the North Caucasus has been, there's not really any reason to be very optimistic. The North Caucasus experience tells us that occupation might lead to increased interethnic tensions in Crimea, as Tatars will protest the return to the state which was responsible for their expulsion in the first place. Secondly, if the law of rehabilitation is indeed applied to the Crimean Tatars, this might also have reverberations in the North Caucasus, as it may open a new round of claims by other ethnic groups, such as the Ingush or the Balkars, who have sort of been denied their return, their rightful lands of their ancestors. So therefore, I would argue that the law is unlikely to be fully implemented, which would underscore the sense of historical injustice in the peninsula and most certainly lead to rising ethnic tensions. So a second aspect worth mentioning is the likely increased isolation of the entire Crimean population. And this we can kind of understand better by looking at Abkhazia and the seceded Republic of Abkhazia and the experience of the Abkhaz population. Since Abkhazia is not a recognized independent state by most countries, Abkhaz population has had to use Russian passports when traveling abroad. And after the 2008 war, these passports were actually rejected by the European Union and many other states because they had a special serial number so that the states could actually tell that they were issued to Abkhaz citizen. And that led to an increased isolation of the Abkhaz population as an entirety. This scenario is now also maybe facing the Crimean population, and while it doesn't really sound all that dramatic that they're not able to travel, in fact it might have very serious long-term social and economic costs to the Crimean population. So moving on to the consequences for regional autonomy and democracy, based on experiences again from the Northern Caucasus, it is also prudent to predict that the referendum on independence in Crimea on March 16 was probably the peak of regional autonomy in Crimea as exercised by the Crimean population. Under the Ukraine, Crimea had extensive autonomy, including a regional parliament and several quota representatives in the Ukrainian Rada. As of today, Russia has moved to diminish the size of the Crimean population from 100 people to a mere 17 deputies. So only less than 2 weeks after their secession, you see a very rapid diminishing of democracy and representation. It is also clear that Putin's decision to strengthen the power vertical in the Northern Caucasus, as seen as his rejection of popularly elected regional executives, most recently seen in Dagestan, may lead to increased inter-ethnic and inter-religious tension, as appointed individuals may have less legitimacy and less stake in maintaining a very fine balance that is required to keep otherwise very heterogeneous regions stable. So the implications for Crimea's ability to exercise regional autonomy and local democracy should be pretty obvious. So in terms of socio-political developments in Crimea, I have argued that based on experience from the North Caucasus, we should expect increased ethnic tensions, increasing isolation of the Crimean population, and diminishing local democracy and autonomy. When it comes to economic development, I think it is also very plausible that Crimea will follow the company of other frozen conflicts, such as Abkhazia or perhaps the Nagorno-Karabakh, yet of course with its own specificities. Crimea is comparatively richer and more economically developed than any of the remaining frozen conflicts. And additionally, the region has not been devastated by warfare, such as many other regions were. So the chances for continued economic growth, given Russian investment, may be better than most places. Based also on very generous regional revival grants, such as to Chechnya and to Abkhazia, it is possible that Russia will fuel a similar economic package in Crimea. However, it remains to be seen whether this will be enough to counter the almost certain departure of international investment and companies in Crimea. So, to conclude, Russia has had more than 20 years of experience manipulating its neighboring countries by the means of creating and maintaining unresolved territorial conflicts. The West seems to only now really have realized the implications of having closed their eyes for so long to the persistence of these conflicts and their crucial role in furthering Russia's own foreign policy objectives. However, if we are really to draw one lesson from studying the North Caucasus, I think it is that the West is unlikely to be able to do very much about the current crisis, especially as it looks from the perspective of minority population in Crimea. At the very least, however, I hope that this is a wake-up call that will serve to strengthen academic and popular interest in the Caucasus region. And I also believe that this region holds the crucial lessons for how to deal with Russia in the future. Thank you very much.